Today we're making a bathroom vanity for my new house. The sink and side panels are made from white concrete, and the door and shelf out of red oak, stained with Minwax solid color stain. I'm going to start by making melamine molds to make the white concrete side panels. I ripped down strips of melamine 3 inches wide, and then used my Kreg jig to drill a bunch of pocket holes in them. This is a pretty basic way that I make concrete panels, because then it makes it really easy to screw these rails down to a bigger piece of melamine so that when I cast these panels, they'll have one side that's nice and smooth with no troweling needed. All 3 of these panels are going to be the same height, and I tried to conserve material by casting 2 of the panels together. I seal up the inside cracks with silicone, and the outside I just used a bunch of hot glue. This just provides a little bit of reinforcement and an additional safety layer of sealing. I often glue together pieces of plywood to make thick plywood cores that go in my concrete panels. I clear coat them so they don't absorb too much water, and this just reduces the weight of the panels, and it gives me a way to attach these panels to wood structures. I'm making my own concrete mix by using sand and white Portland cement in a 5-to-1 ratio. I've used this combination often and it works quite well for me, but for beginners I would recommend going with a pre-mixed concrete mix, and preferably one that has fiber reinforcement. I want to get out the majority of the air bubbles, so when I set these molds I set them on top of a bunch of 2x4s. This way I can use my hammer drill and the hammer only function to vibrate the concrete and get most of the bubbles out. The plywood cores are 1.5 inches thick, which means the thinnest piece of concrete here is also 1.5 inches. I wouldn't go much thinner than that if you didn't add fiber reinforcement. Now I need to make a crude structure out of 2x4s. This structure is going to go inside the concrete panels and is going to serve as the attachment point to the walls of the bathroom. For the storage underneath the vanity, I'm just going with a pretty simple volume with shelves on one side. But if you did want to be more organized, you could do this structure out of plywood and build the shelves in a more deliberate manner. For the visible wood components, I'm using 3/4 inch red oak. And I'm even making my own custom sliding door. So I glued a thin 1-inch strip of red oak to a wider 5.5 inch piece. And I just made 2 of these. And this is going to serve as the track for a 3/4 inch door that rolls on some ball bearings. For the door panel, I used my biscuit joiner to cut a bunch of slots, and then I just glued 3 pieces of oak together. Now that I knew the rough size of the door, I was ready to finish up the track, and I glued up 3 pieces of plywood to act as a spacer in between the 2 long oak panels. I drilled some 1/4 inch holes so I can install bolts and ball bearings, and those ball bearings will ride right on top of those little strips of oak that I glued to either side of those 5.5 inch wide panels. I did a test run with the door just to make sure I had the right amount of washers to use as spacers, and that my bolts were the correct length. Now that I know how the door will hang, I can trim the door panel to just the right length, and then sanded everything to 220 grit. This video is sponsored by Minwax, and I'm using 3 of their products to get this nice green finish on this oak. I'm going to start with the pre-stained wood conditioner. This cleans the wood, removes any dust and oil, and it helps stains go on much more evenly so you don't get any of those blotches. To apply this pre-stain conditioner, I just like to use a clean rag. Once that pre-stain conditioner had fully dried, we got to applying the color itself, and we're using the Minwax solid color stain in Winter Moss. The color's fantastic. I'm using it throughout this bathroom. It goes really well with the white concrete. And what I like about the Minwax stains is that you still see the real wood grain through them. I like to apply it with a rag, but a high quality brush also works well. I typically apply a pretty heavy coat and then use that rag to wipe off the excess and reveal as much grain as I want. Once the stain had fully dried, I moved on to adding a protective layer. And I'm using Minwax polyacrylic in clear matte. I went with 2 coats with a light sanding of 400 grit sandpaper in between. This is going to give me a really nice protective layer, which is really important when you're using wood in a bathroom. For colored stains in particular, I like to apply them before assembling the pieces. This way you don't get too much color buildup in the inside corners. This set of shelves made out of 8-inch wide boards is going to fit inside one of those 2x4 structures on the more visible right side underneath the sink. Remember those 2x4 structures? Well, I painted them white, and now that my concrete panels have cured, I can screw them to the plywood inside the panels. Now the big front panel is going to have the door sliding right inside, so I didn't want to get it too bulky on the connection. So I used some big steel L brackets to connect the two concrete panels together. The panels are really heavy, so I only want to move them one at a time. So I assembled as much of the wood part that I could, got that into place, and then Jesse and I wheeled and kind of slid the panels into place before screwing through the wood structure and into the plywood inside the panels. This took a little finagling. We had to line up the wood structure with the studs in the wall. We had to put in some shims so that the concrete panel would be nice and straight, all the while making sure that we weren't smashing any fingers with these 250-pound panels. I'm not going to lie, the inside of this cabinet isn't going to be the most aesthetic thing, but even with really nice cabinets, underneath sinks tends to be kind of a damp, not so great space. But there isn't any particle board and all the materials are pretty durable, and as long as I got plenty of room to fix any sort of leaky pipes, I'm pretty confident everything will work out. I already used a stud finder to mark the locations of the studs behind the drywall, and I secured the 2x4 frames using 3.5-inch long screws. I was pleasantly surprised that everything was mostly level and square, and so I went ahead and screwed those green shells inside the 2x4 structure on the right. Now I can attach the railing for the door, and I start by just adding the first half. And then I place the door in, and then I screw in the back half. Should the door get stuck, I can use my right angle attachment on the drill to unscrew these screws and clean out the track. So the base is pretty much ready, but now it's time for the difficult part, which is making the sink and countertop. This is going to be the heaviest piece, and doing concrete sinks is always a little bit of a pain. The mold for the countertop is going to be the same as the panels, just a big melamine shallow box, but I need to make an insert that will carve out the space for the sink. And so I just layered up some MDF, routed the edges to give it a nice radius, and then used my table saw to slice it into pieces, because this piece isn't going to just pull right out of concrete, even if I added all the mold release in the world. I need to be able to pull it out in some pieces, and beveled cuts really makes it easier to do that, provided you put the pieces in at the right angle so you can pull the first piece out and then get the additional pieces out a little easier. I used a hole saw to drill a 1/2-inch thick piece of material, and that's going to serve as a little bit of a recess in the bottom of the sink so that my drain plug sits nice and low. I applied 3 coats of Minwax polyacrylic to the MDF. It really soaks up a lot of it, especially on the edges, and I sand in between the coats, so this came out real smooth. So I got these 5 pieces of sink insert, and they go together like a puzzle. And I raised up the melamine mold for the countertop so I could screw through the bottom to secure these pieces into place. For the hole that's going to allow me to install the faucet, and for the drain, I'm just using pieces of PVC pipe. Now, the thickness of the countertop is way too thick for the threaded attachment for the faucet, so I had to use some couplings on the PVC so I don't have to get a threaded rod extender for the faucet. Digging wood out of concrete is not the easiest thing to do, so I took a bunch of soy candle wax and melted it down. I'm going to basically coat all the MDF with this wax. This wax melts really easily, so if the wood starts to get stuck into the concrete, I can just use a heat gun or a torch to kind of melt that layer in between the MDF and the concrete, which will hopefully loosen up the mold and let me get the sink insert pieces out. Now, I could have used a heat gun to smooth out those edges, but I kind of like the way the drippy parts look, and I think that'll help the sink insert look like it was carved out of a soft white travertine-like stone. I mixed up a whole bunch more of the white concrete and started placing it into the mold. I vibrated as I went, and I added in some wood panels to keep the weight down and to give me some attachment points. I let the concrete cure for a full week before removing the mold. And I was starting to second guess myself a little bit. I mean, it's pretty thick, but there's no fiber in this, and I thought it would be wise to add some additional reinforcement. So what I did was I squirted a whole bunch of Quikrete anchoring epoxy, which is just a super strong adhesive, and I combined that with some fiber mesh tape. So I basically added a layer of kind of DIY fiberglass on the underside of this, and then I added some angle steel that I screwed to the plywood panels and epoxied to the underside of the concrete. This should just give me a little bit of additional support, and now I just have to figure out how to move this super heavy piece. The entire thing weighs almost 400 pounds, and it's a pretty awkward lift. We focused first on just flipping it over, and I made a little protective crate for it out of some 2x4s. Then we tilted it up on its side and slowly started to make the trek from the master bedroom into the bathroom. We set some 2x4s down so we could really place it and slide it in, and luckily no one smashed their fingers too bad. I started scraping away the wax with a knife and then put a couple screws into the first piece of MDF that I was going to try to pull out. Well, didn't come out that easy. Tried a bunch of things, but I didn't want to put too much force on it and potentially break the concrete. So I used my multi-tool and a drill just to kind of loosen up around the cracks, and eventually just got frustrated and drilled a bunch of holes right into the MDF, used the multi-tool to cut out a big piece, and then was able to pry it up. The airtight seal and suction seems to be the thing that makes it hard to pull it out, and the wax really did seal it all up. But once I got that first piece out, I was able to take a putty knife and slide it under the next piece and pop that right out. The layer of wax was about 1/8 of an inch thick, so there certainly was a mess of scraped up wax, but once that first piece was out, everything else went real easy. Pried out that last little circle of MDF, knocked out the hot glue, and even though I didn't need to, I did take the angle grinder and just round over the edges just a little bit more. The faucet goes right through the PVC pipe that I cast into the countertop. Then I just have to get underneath the sink and bolt it in place using the threaded rod. Now I'm ready to call the plumber and have him connect the drain lines. I had these Mandalorian heads left over from a previous project. They're made out of tin and bismuths, and I just drilled a hole and bolted it right on. To seal the concrete, I'm using the Chang & Co. concrete sealer. You start by just getting the concrete nice and wet. You see, this is a liquid acrylic sealer, and you're going to start with different diluted mixtures of it, and the goal is to get it to penetrate down into the concrete, and it moves better with concrete that's already wet. So you start by just using rags and a sponge to get everything nice and damp, and then you use progressively stronger mixtures. And I started with about a 25% mixture and then a 50% mixture before going with a full 100% coating of the sealer. The key here is to never let the sealer dry no matter what mixture you're at. And so I also have a spray bottle of just straight water. And so once I apply one of the mixtures, I watch it, and as soon as it starts to get a little too dry, I just spritz it with the pure water. And you do this for about 5 minutes with each of the concentrations, and then you're all done. Rinse everything off, and you got a nice sealed piece of concrete. I'm really excited about having this generous amount of countertop space. And up next, I got to make the mirrored cabinet that goes above the sink. And I'm going to use the same combination of Minwax preconditioner, stain, and sealers. I really want this bathroom to be sort of light in color with touches of green and probably a lot of plants. This is the new house that we built from scratch, and don't worry, we're going to give a whole tour of the entire house once everything's in place. Material-wise, this was a pretty inexpensive project, but it was one of the more step-intensive and tedious ones that I've done recently. Now, I kind of like my concrete to be imperfect. If I wanted a perfect material, I would just use quartz like everyone else. The selling point for me here is the kind of thick, chunky, monolithic nature of the design with just a touch of color. Suits me, but if you want something a little more polished, I would recommend more of a solid surface material like corian or quartz. I've used concrete countertops like this in my last few houses, and every once in a while it'll develop a little bit of a hairline crack, but I haven't had any issues with any of them breaking, and certainly not with any of them leaking, but there's always a little epoxy sealers that you can use if you get a little nervous about the cracks. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks to Minwax for sponsoring this project.